The dim glow of the streetlights barely illuminated the parking lot of the pancake house. It was already past closing time, and the area was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of distant traffic. That night, April 28, 2016, Keith Green had left his temporary residence with a calm demeanor. He didn't take his wallet or keys, just his phone. He was heading across the street to meet someone he once loved, someone who had been a central figure in his life, Tiffany Lee. Keith was a promising young man, a culinary student with dreams of providing a better future for his two daughters. But life had taken a cruel turn. His relationship with Tiffany had soured months ago. What once was a story of love and ambition had turned into a bitter clash over money, power, and custody. That meeting was meant to be about the children. It wasn't unusual for Keith and Tiffany to argue. The scars of their failed relationship were fresh and deep. Yet, this time felt different. The next morning, Keith's absence was palpable. Calls went unanswered. His family and friends began to worry. Angela Dunn, the family friend who had been sheltering Keith since his split with Tiffany, reported him missing. She mentioned his plans to meet Tiffany the previous night. That was the last anyone had heard from him. Flyers were printed and distributed throughout the neighborhood, plastered on poles and in shop windows. Friends searched tirelessly, combing the areas he was known to frequent. His mother, Colleen Green, called everyone she could think of. She begged for information. The police began their investigation but had little to go on. There was no sign of struggle, no immediate leads, only questions. Where could he have gone? Why hadn't he returned home? Days turned into weeks, and the family's hope began to fade. Then, on May 11th, an anonymous call led Sonoma County deputies to a remote field near Geyserville, 2 hours north of San Francisco. There, amidst the tall grass, lay the answer no one wanted to find. A man's body stripped down to his socks, his front teeth broken, a single gunshot wound to the neck. Dental records confirmed it. Keith Green was dead. The details were haunting. He had been left in a desolate field like discarded refuse, his body marred by violence. As investigators processed the scene, they couldn't ignore the glaring disparity between Keith's humble life and the affluence of his ex-girlfriend. Tiffany Lee, heiress to a real estate fortune worth tens of millions, had been the last person to see him alive. Tiffany's story was simple, almost rehearsed. She admitted to meeting Keith at the pancake house. They had spoken for about an hour, she said, mostly about the children and how to arrange visitation. Afterward, she claimed, she had driven away alone in her gray Mercedes-Benz SUV. Keith had stayed behind, walking away into the night. She hadn't heard from him since. But her calm demeanor raised suspicions. Why hadn't she reported his disappearance sooner? When asked, she offered a bizarre explanation. She thought Keith might be faking his disappearance to extort money from her. It wasn't out of character, she insisted. Their relationship had become toxic, filled with financial disputes and custody battles. Keith, she claimed, had demanded an exorbitant amount of money, millions of dollars, for each of their children. Her mother, the formidable matriarch of the Lee family, had laughed off his demands. Yet something about her account didn't add up. Surveillance footage painted a different picture. Cameras captured Tiffany's SUV leaving the pancake house and heading toward Hillsborough, the affluent enclave where she resided. A luxury mansion, courtesy of her mother's vast real estate empire, was her sanctuary. But what happened between her departure from the parking lot and Keith's untimely death in that field? In the days following Keith's disappearance, Tiffany's actions became increasingly suspicious. She emailed the Hillsborough police, seemingly concerned, asking about putting up a billboard for Keith. She even texted his mother, Colleen, feigning worry. But her words felt hollow, a calculated attempt to deflect attention. Behind the scenes, Tiffany's life was anything but quiet. She had moved on from Keith, entangling herself with a new lover, Cave Bayat. Their relationship was anything but discreet. Cave, a friend of Keith's, had quickly taken Keith's place in Tiffany's life and her mansion. Together they indulged in extravagance, purchasing a Ferrari, flaunting their wealth, and raising Tiffany's children as if they were his own. For Tiffany, life moved forward unabated. But for Keith's family, the loss was immeasurable. Colleen's cries for justice echoed unanswered. Each piece of evidence uncovered in those early days pointed towards something sinister. The meeting at the pancake house, the bitter disputes, and the mysterious journey that ended in Keith's lifeless body being discarded far from home. For investigators, this was no longer a missing persons case. It was murder. The question was, who had the motive, the means, and the heartlessness to end Keith Green's life so brutally? The air in the interrogation room was heavy, the kind of weight that came with lies tangled in half-truths. Tiffany Lee sat across from the detectives, her posture calm, almost casual. Her words, though measured, betrayed no emotion. "I left Keith in the parking lot. I drove home," she repeated, unwavering. It was a simple story, but simple stories rarely hold under the microscope of a murder investigation. Detectives knew there was more to uncover. The bitterness between Keith and Tiffany was no secret. Their arguments over money and custody had become increasingly heated. Tiffany, with her family's fortune behind her, seemed to hold all the power. Keith, on the other hand, was struggling. His culinary school tuition, his modest lifestyle, it had all been funded by Tiffany's family. But now, he was on his own, scrambling to stay afloat while fighting to remain in his daughters' lives. Then there was the new man in Tiffany's life, Cave Bayat. Keith had once considered him a friend, but that bond was shattered when Cave moved into the Hillsborough mansion, stepping into Keith's place in more ways than one. Cave, with his flashy demeanor and penchant for luxury, didn't just replace Keith in the home, he replaced him in the family. Tiffany's daughters now called Cave Daddy, a devastating blow to the man who had adored them. But there was more than jealousy at play. Investigators uncovered a series of messages between Tiffany and Cave that painted a chilling picture. In one exchange, Keith's name came up in a tone that was cold and calculating. "He's trying to work you for money again," Cave texted. Tiffany's response was curt, green light. 2 words, simple but sinister. Detectives dug deeper, and the details became even darker. Cave wasn't just Tiffany's lover, he was an active participant in the unfolding tragedy. He had brought a man into their orbit, someone who could help them deal with a problem. That man was Olivia Adela. Adela, a former a fighter and sometime bodyguard, was no stranger to the Lee family. Tiffany had set him up in an apartment complex owned by her mother, provided him with a steady flow of cash, and even hired his wife to work in the family business. It was clear that Adela was indebted to Tiffany, and in 2016, she called in that debt. The scheme began to take shape in late February or early March of that year. Adela later told investigators that Tiffany and Cave approached him with a proposal: "Get rid of Keith." The words hung heavy in the air as he recalled the moment. He claimed he had refused outright, offering only to scare Keith, but the couple was persistent. Their need to eliminate Keith wasn't just about money, it was about control. On the night of April 28th, Adela's role became clear. Surveillance footage placed him near the Pancake House in his silver Chrysler 300, following Tiffany's SUV. As Tiffany later drove toward Hillsborough, Adela's car wasn't far behind. What happened next would become the crux of the investigation. According to Adela, he returned to his apartment, but the night was far from over. Sometime later, Tiffany arrived at his building. Keith was in the front seat of her SUV, lifeless, a gunshot wound to his neck. Adela claimed that Cave, who was also in the vehicle, told him it was time to pull his weight. Frightened and unsure of what to do, Adela complied. He drove Keith's body north, past the Golden Gate Bridge, and left him in the remote field where he would later be found. The details of that night were harrowing. Adela described how Keith had been stripped down to his socks, his clothing stuffed into a gym bag that was disposed of in the apartment complex's trash. Keith's phone, a crucial piece of evidence, was tossed out of a car window as Adela crossed through Golden Gate Park. The murder weapon, a 9mm handgun, was never recovered, but Adela alleged that Cave had obtained it specifically for this purpose. Back at the Hillsborough mansion, investigators found traces of Keith's blood in the garage. Gunshot residue was detected on a golf bag nearby. Even more damning, blood matching Keith's was found in Adela's car and on the running board of Tiffany's Mercedes. Every piece of evidence pointed to a cold, calculated plan to remove Keith from their lives permanently. But Tiffany and Cave didn't just orchestrate the murder, they flaunted their new life without Keith. Cave paraded around in a Ferrari that Tiffany had purchased for him. The couple continued their lavish lifestyle, as if nothing had happened, their actions a brazen display of indifference to the life they had taken. Detectives pieced together the timeline, each discovery painting a more sinister picture. What began as a bitter custody dispute had spiraled into a conspiracy fueled by greed and cruelty. The question remained, how far were they willing to go to silence Keith Green forever? The phone call came in the early hours of May 12th. Colleen Green answered with trembling hands, her heart already heavy with dread. The voice on the other end confirmed what she had feared most. Her son, Keith, was gone. She dropped the phone, her legs giving way beneath her as grief consumed her. In that moment, the life she had known shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Keith wasn't just a victim. He was a father, a son, a brother, and a friend. His absence left an unfillable void in the lives of those who loved him. Colleen, who had always been her son's fiercest advocate, now found herself the caretaker of his legacy. More than that, she had to become the protector of Keith's two daughters, who were too young to understand the gravity of what had happened. The days following the discovery of Keith's body were an unrelenting storm of grief and chaos. Colleen fought to keep herself composed as she worked with investigators, demanding answers. She pored over every detail, every shred of evidence, trying to piece together the final hours of her son's life. But the answers that came were worse than anything she could have imagined. Learning that Tiffany, the mother of her granddaughters, was at the center of this nightmare was a blow that Colleen struggled to process. She had always suspected Tiffany of manipulation, but this, to orchestrate Keith's murder, it was beyond comprehension. And Cave Bayat, once a friend to Keith, now a man accused of helping to end his life, it was a betrayal that cut even deeper. For Colleen, every revelation felt like a new wound. The messages between Tiffany and Cave, the callous green light, the discovery of Keith's blood in their vehicles and home, each piece of evidence was a reminder of how calculated and cruel the crime had been. Worse still was the knowledge that Keith had been reduced to a bargaining chip, his life snuffed out over money and power. As the legal battle unfolded, Colleen was thrust into the role of both grieving mother and guardian of Keith's daughters. She attended every hearing, her face a mask of quiet determination, even as the weight of the tragedy threatened to crush her. The courtroom became a battlefield where she relived the horror of her son's death, again and again, through testimony and evidence. The girls, Vivian and Nia, were too young to understand the full extent of what had happened. Colleen struggled to shield them from the chaos while preserving Keith's memory in their young minds. But she couldn't shield them from everything. They were living in a world where their mother was accused of conspiring to kill their father, where the people they trusted most had become symbols of betrayal and loss. Colleen's nights were sleepless. She would sit by the window, staring into the darkness, her mind replaying memories of Keith as a boy. His laughter, his dreams, his love for his daughters, those were the things she clung to. But the grief was relentless. It came in waves, drowning her in guilt, anger, and sorrow. The financial strain compounded the emotional toll. While Tiffany had the resources of a vast family fortune at her disposal, Colleen was left to navigate the legal system with limited means. She leaned on friends, family, and the community, but the disparity was stark. Tiffany's $35 million bail, a record-breaking sum, highlighted the glaring inequality in their fight for justice. For the daughters, the impact of their father's absence and their mother's alleged betrayal was immeasurable. They had lost one parent to violence and were in danger of losing the other to the justice system. Colleen worried about their future, about how the trauma would shape them, about whether they would ever fully understand the truth of what happened. Despite everything, Colleen refused to give up. She fought to ensure that Keith's story would not be forgotten. She fought for justice, not just for her son, but for his daughters, who deserved to grow up knowing the truth. Her pain became her fuel, driving her to seek accountability for the people who had stolen Keith's life. But as the months turned into years and the courtroom drama dragged on, Colleen's hope began to waver. The legal system moved at a snail's pace, and with every delay, the weight of uncertainty grew heavier. She clung to her faith in justice, even as it seemed to slip further from her grasp. The grief of losing a child is a wound that never heals. For Colleen, it became a scar she carried into every day, a reminder of what was stolen from her. Yet, she remained steadfast. For Keith, for his daughters, for the justice they all deserved. The case of Keith Green's murder didn't just devastate his family, it struck a nerve in society, sparking debates about privilege, justice, and morality. Headlines across the nation dissected every lurid detail, from Tiffany Lee's extravagant lifestyle to the sinister nature of the crime itself. This wasn't just a murder case, it was a mirror reflecting the stark inequities in the justice system and the chilling lengths some would go to protect their wealth and image. When Tiffany Lee posted a record-breaking $35 million bail, it was as if a grenade had gone off in the court of public opinion. Critics decried the blatant display of wealth, arguing that it highlighted a two-tiered system of justice, one for the rich and one for everyone else. While most defendants languished in jail awaiting trial because they couldn't afford bail, Tiffany's family effortlessly secured her release by leveraging a vast real estate empire. The mansion she returned to stood in sharp contrast to the grief-stricken home of Keith's mother, Colleen, who struggled to navigate the financial burden of her son's death. The public outcry wasn't just about the money, it was about the message. For many, Tiffany's freedom was a glaring example of how the wealthy could manipulate the system. Justice for sale, one protester's sign read during a courthouse demonstration. The case became a flashpoint for debates about bail reform, with activists demanding an overhaul of a system that allowed wealth to dictate freedom. But the impact extended beyond the courtroom. The revelations of Keith's murder laid bare the moral corrosion often masked by affluence. Tiffany and Cave's extravagant displays of wealth, buying luxury cars, hosting lavish parties while Keith's family mourned in silence, were viewed as grotesque symbols of indifference. The public watched in disbelief as two people, implicated in such a heinous crime, seemed to flaunt their impunity. The details of the murder itself also left a chilling impression. The text messages between Tiffany and Cave, the blood in the garage, and the calculated disposal of Keith's body painted a picture of premeditated cruelty. For many, this wasn't just a crime of passion, it was a calculated execution, driven by greed and entitlement. It was the kind of story that stayed with people, gnawing at their sense of safety and morality. As media coverage intensified, it wasn't just the murder that came under scrutiny. Tiffany's background, her family's fortune, and their ties to powerful institutions became subjects of public fascination and criticism. The Lee family's success story, built on lucrative real estate ventures, was recast in a darker light. Questions about their ethics, their use of influence, and their response to the allegations against Tiffany swirled in the media. The case also exposed deeper societal issues, including the challenges faced by victims and their families in navigating a justice system that often seemed to prioritize the rights of the accused. For Colleen Green, the battle for her son's memory was uphill. She fought not only against Tiffany's wealth, but also against a legal system that seemed ill-equipped to handle the complexities of the case. Public support for Colleen swelled as people rallied behind her quest for justice, but the fight took its toll. In communities across the country, Keith's story sparked uncomfortable conversations about power dynamics in relationships, the vulnerability of victims, and the dangerous consequences of unchecked privilege. People questioned how someone like Tiffany, with her resources and education, could be involved in such a heinous act. What drove her and Cave to such extremes? The answers weren't simple, but the questions lingered, haunting those who followed the case. The trial also revealed flaws in the investigation itself, further eroding public confidence in the system. The reliance on Olivier Adela's testimony, despite his questionable credibility, and the lack of physical evidence tying Tiffany directly to the crime scene created an air of uncertainty. When Tiffany was acquitted, the public reaction was split: outrage from some, resignation from others. For many, it was a sobering reminder that justice isn't always about truth, it's about what can be proven. As the dust settled, the impact of the case continued to ripple through society. Keith's death became more than a tragedy, it became a symbol of the lengths to which power and privilege could distort justice. His story sparked discussions about reform, about the need for a system that protects the vulnerable and holds the powerful accountable. But for Keith's family, and for those who mourned him, the cost of that lesson was far too high. The investigation into Keith Green's murder was, from the outset, fraught with challenges. For the San Mateo County Sheriff's Department, it was not just a matter of solving a murder, but navigating the complexities of a case that involved extreme wealth, influence, and a cast of characters as enigmatic as the crime itself. From the moment Keith was reported missing, law enforcement knew they were dealing with more than just a routine case. His sudden disappearance, the abandoned car keys, and the lack of communication pointed to foul play. Yet, the initial search offered few clues. It wasn't until his body was discovered in a remote field in Geyserville 2 weeks later that the investigation took a decisive turn. Detectives immediately turned their attention to Tiffany Lee. As the last person known to have seen Keith alive, she became a prime suspect. Her initial account of their meeting at the Pancake House seemed plausible on the surface, but inconsistencies began to emerge. Surveillance footage contradicted her claim that she drove straight home after their conversation. Instead, it showed her vehicle heading toward Hillsborough, her affluent neighborhood, trailed by a silver Chrysler 300 driven by Olivier Adela. The pieces began to fall into place. Traces of Keith's blood were found in Tiffany's garage and on her Mercedes-Benz, while more damning evidence was uncovered in Adela's car and apartment. Adela's confession provided investigators with a timeline of events that implicated both Tiffany and her new lover, Cave Bayat. Yet, his testimony was not without its complications. Adela, a man with a murky past and questionable credibility, became both a key witness and a liability. His initial denial of involvement quickly shifted to a detailed account of the crime, painting Tiffany and Cave as the masterminds. However, his motivations were suspect. Did he cooperate out of fear for his own culpability, or was he attempting to shift the blame to others? The district attorney's office faced a daunting task, building a case that relied heavily on circumstantial evidence and the word of a man with a history of deception. Adela's eventual plea deal in exchange for testimony further complicated matters, raising questions about the strength of the prosecution's case. Critics argued that by cutting a deal with Adela, the justice system had compromised its integrity. The trial itself became a spectacle, dominated by the stark contrast between the defense's portrayal of Tiffany as a misunderstood mother and the prosecution's depiction of her as a calculating killer. The courtroom saw heated exchanges, expert testimony, and emotional pleas from Keith's family. Yet the evidence was not as airtight as prosecutors had hoped. The lack of a murder weapon, inconclusive gunshot residue findings, and the questionable credibility of Adela's account left room for doubt. When the jury returned with a verdict, it was a moment that underscored the challenges of achieving justice in a case this complex. Tiffany Lee was acquitted of all charges, a decision that sent shockwaves through the community. Cave Bayat's trial ended in a mistrial, and prosecutors ultimately chose not to retry him, citing the unlikelihood of securing a conviction. For law enforcement and the justice system, the outcome was a bitter pill to swallow. Years of investigation, countless hours spent piecing together evidence, and the emotional toll on everyone involved culminated in a sense of unfinished justice. Prosecutors defended their efforts, emphasizing the difficulties of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, but the public's faith in the system was deeply shaken. The aftermath of the case highlighted systemic issues that extended far beyond the courtroom. The use of money and influence to secure Tiffany's unprecedented $35 million bail became a symbol of inequality. Meanwhile, the reliance on a flawed witness like Adela exposed the challenges law enforcement faces when key evidence is lacking. For Keith's family, the justice system's failure to hold anyone accountable was a devastating blow. Colleen Green, Keith's mother, expressed her anguish in the days following the verdict. "They took my son from me, and now they get to walk free," she said, her voice trembling with grief. Her words echoed the sentiment of a community that had rallied behind her, only to see their hopes for justice dashed. The case of Keith Green remains a haunting example of the limits of the justice system. It revealed the cracks in law enforcement's ability to navigate cases involving immense privilege and complex conspiracies. More than that, it forced society to confront the uncomfortable reality that justice, for all its ideals, is not always served.